Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the second to the last webinar in the IPS webinar series, Progressive Politics in the Time of Pandemic. And today we're going to be speaking with or presenting to you will be my colleague John Feffer on the coronavirus, authoritarianism, and the far right. And this was a series that IPS, this is part of a series that IPS put on or initiated at the beginning of, toward the beginning of this pandemic. And we had a few, we've already gone through a number of the things. The last session, this is going to be a week from today, will be with our colleague Sarah Anderson. It's going to be on why we need to save the Postal Service. And a lot of people don't know that the Postal Service is actually under a threat of being, or maybe not enough people know, under threat of being abolished. And so that they've been doing, Sarah and her group of people that she's been working on been doing a lot around that, and is going to present that to us. Now, we want to ask you to join that. You have all these are registered in advance, so I'm going to put the link to that so you can register for it as soon as I find it. But then we also want to do a few housekeeping things in terms of how this is going to go. A lot of people have been on Zoom lately for a lot of reasons, so you probably know a lot about Zoom, but for those who may not, at the bottom of this, in terms of this webinar feature, the people who are attending, you don't have cameras or audio, but you do have the chat feature, which we welcome you to use and share anything you want. But for question and answer, we have a feature that should be a couple icons to the left of your chat, which says Q&A. And you want to click on that and add your questions there, and it makes it a little bit easier to manage. And then I think John has a special way he's going to do this for us today. So I want to introduce my colleague John Feffer. He's the director of the Foreign Policy and Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies, and he's the author most recently of Aftershock, A Journey into the Eastern Europe's Broken Dreams. And he's also the author of the dystopian novel Splinterlands published by Dispatch Books. I mean, there's a lot you could say about John and about a lot of my IPS colleagues. We don't really have all that kind of time. So we're not going to do that. I'm just going to hand it over to John. I'm going to disappear and let him do it. Well, he has his own format. So let you do that. I'm trying to think if I missed anything. The introductions were a little longer earlier in this series because I could say a little bit more about each thing, but I don't have to do that. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to John. Thank you, John.
Excellent. Thank you, Netfa. I really appreciate the introduction and this opportunity to talk to folks. Before I start talking, I just want to encourage people to ask questions throughout. You don't have to wait until the end of my remarks, and you should take Gary O'Connor's lead here. He's already asked a question about the World Congress of Families, and that's something I will address as we get to that portion. But feel free to ask questions throughout, and I'll incorporate my answers into my remarks. And also, please use the chat function to comment, to add links, and to emphasize takeaway points that you think are worth emphasizing. Before I begin, I wanted to just show you the copy of this. This is a Battle for Another World. It was our IPS report on the rise of the far right internationally. And a lot of people think of the far right as being nationalist and kind of confined to the boundaries of particular countries. But in fact, the far right has been very active internationally as well. Not only leaders kind of cooperating with one another, but also civil society organizations like the World Congress of Families, working across borders to promote their agenda. So I would encourage you to take a look at that report. I put a link to it in the chat. But of course, the report came out in December 2019, before the coronavirus. And so this is an opportunity to talk about how the far right has actually taken advantage of this moment, taken advantage of this crisis to both consolidate its power within particular countries, but also to kind of expand its organizing globally. I'm going to talk about basically three categories here. I'm going to talk about the far right in power, leaders like, of course, Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Narendra Modi in India. So the far right that was already basically in power when the coronavirus hit. And then I'm going to talk about kind of far right opposition movements and parties that were not in power when the coronavirus hit, and what has happened with them, how they've tried to take advantage of the situation. And then we're going to talk about the extreme right. And so there's usually a distinction in political science between, yes, Duterte in the Philippines as well. But there's usually a distinction between the far right and the extreme right. The far right contests for power in democratic elections and sometimes undemocratic elections, but they're interested in basically taking over the state apparatus through political means. The extreme right, for the most part, is not interested in contesting as a political party for power. It's interested in operating kind of extra politically, often violently, often to take down the system rather than to enter the system. So there has been classically a distinction between the far right trying to get into power and the extreme right trying to take down the system. And in this report and in other writings, I've talked about the alt-right, or what I prefer to call the new right, as a kind of meeting ground for these two, for the far right and the extreme right. The new right is an opportunity for the two groups which previously were rather opposed to one another to come together in support of a particular leader, for instance, Donald Trump or Bolsonaro, or on behalf of a particular ideology or platform. And so that's the kind of general overview of what I'm going to talk about right now. Now, in order to kind of discuss the impact of the coronavirus, I think it's important to identify the kind of three major intersecting trends that allowed the new right to come to power, to expand its power over the last 10 to 12 years. And I identified basically a political trend, an economic trend, and a cultural trend. And the economic trend is the new right has taken advantage of kind of critique of globalization. A critique that's shared with the left for much of this time, but a critique of globalization as not really being of benefit to the majority of people. And there's good statistical evidence to demonstrate that. In other words, if you take away the benefits shared by, say, about 1 billion Chinese, around 800 million Chinese, who have certainly seen their incomes rise as a result of China entering the global economy. If you take those folks out, and if you take out the billionaires who have certainly benefited from globalization, then you see that the larger mass of people have in fact not benefited from globalization. And even if they have marginally benefited, they don't perceive that as a benefit. So there's a great deal of dissatisfaction, disappointment in the globalization project, the project of creating a global economy through free trade and the reduction of any barriers to the free circulation of trade. And that includes deregulation, of course, as well. So the new right has taken advantage of this disappointment and disenchantment with the globalization project to advance its kind of alternative. And its alternative, for the most part, is kind of anti-globalization, or, and more specifically, very much anti-globalist, or against the people who have been kind of in charge of, if you will, this globalization project. Which brings us to the political kind of trend, and that is a critique of status quo parties, mainstream political parties, which by and large over the last 10 to 20 years have supported this project of globalization. Whether we're talking about neoliberals on the right or neoliberals on the left, whether we're talking about social democratic parties, whether we're even talking about former communist parties, if we're talking about Eastern Europe, there is a tremendous consensus around the importance of pushing globalization forward. And these political parties essentially hitched their wagons to this economic project. So obviously, the far right has taken advantage of not only a disenchantment with globalization more generally, but a disenchantment with the mainstream political parties that are associated with this project. Now, the third element is an equally important element, because a lot of people have voted for the far right. It has nothing to do with politics, it has nothing to do with economics. They're doing so because of cultural reasons. In other words, there is a perception of a major demographic shift that is against the interests of majority populations. And the far right has taken advantage of this perception, which is racist perception in white majority countries, anti-Islamic, anti-Chinese, depends of course on what the minority is, the growing minority is in a country. But this kind of cultural trend is central to the far right's appeal, because it makes its appeal on essentially racist and anti-minority grounds. So those are the three: economic, political, and cultural. Now, you throw in the COVID-19 issue, you throw in the coronavirus, and all three of those trends come into play. In other words, COVID-19 is presented by the far right as basically a product of globalization. It's either a product of China, the kind of an engine of globalization, if you will, over the last 10 years as China has not only entered the global economy, but has succeeded so tremendously in the global economy. Or it's a product of the various elements of globalization. In other words, the reason why the COVID virus spread was because of people traveling, cruise ships, airplanes, or because of the circulation of goods. And globalization, from the far right's perspective, is associated with COVID-19 and the COVID-19 spread. And it's also the vulnerabilities that countries have experienced as a result of COVID-19 are also associated with globalization. Again, the perception of the far right, but not exclusively the far right. So for instance, as many people know, China is responsible for more of the PPE, the personal protective equipment, masks, as well as ventilators, medical supplies, than the rest of the world combined. China has been, a major producer, manufacturer of these goods. So when countries began to see the spread of COVID-19 and they realized that they would need these absolutely essential medical supplies, then suddenly there was a realization, do we have enough? Do we have to import them? Are they available? Will China, which is now in the middle of its own COVID-19 crisis in January and February, be able to continue to supply us? So globalization again becomes kind of implicated in a failure of sufficient response to COVID-19. So that's on the economic side. On the political side, of course, the far right was very quick to blame first their predecessors, however improbably, for getting us in the mess that we're in. So for instance, Donald Trump would blame the Obama administration for its failure to prepare the United States for dealing with the pandemic, even though, of course, the Obama administration did quite well in pandemic response, and did nothing like what the Trump administration has done in terms of defunding our pandemic response. But nevertheless, that was the kind of default response of the Trump administration. Or there's a tendency to blame it on the deep state or the so-called expert class, an expert class that has warned about the dangers of this novel coronavirus, has recommended very substantial lockdown response. And this expertise class then becomes a kind of target for the far right. They were wrong before, these politicians and this expert class. They were wrong about globalization. They were wrong about what was a problem for our countries. And they're wrong now about the coronavirus. And then third, of course, the cultural side. The other default response, as soon as coronavirus began to spread, was to blame it on, well, first immigrants for quote unquote bringing the virus across borders, or minorities, for instance, Muslims in India for supposedly incubating the virus, or Jews for unleashing the virus, supposedly. So a kind of far right response that delivered according to their kind of their traditional demographic argument. And this is more than just scapegoating. This is also a question of how the far right understands politics. Politics as preserving the health of the body politic. And the health of the body politic, of course, is expressed usually in racist terms and very gendered terms. And COVID-19 then becomes part of this, this assault on whiteness, on majority, on gender relations in society from the far right's point of view. Okay, so that's kind of the origins of the far right, how the COVID-19 kind of intervenes into this, this question of how the far right achieves power and consolidates power. Now let's talk about these three categories very specifically: the far right in power, the far right in opposition, and then the extreme right, even further out on the edges. The far right in power. And I would divide the far right in power into basically two different categories: the competent and the incompetent. We have, let's start with the incompetent. Since I'm here in the United States, it's easy to talk about the incompetence of the Trump administration. These are leaders, when we're talking about Donald Trump, Jair Bolsonaro, Boris Johnson, people who came to power without any necessary governance strategy. I mean, they were interested in personal power or accumulating power for their families and their coterie. They were interested in what the political scientists call state capture, capturing the state for the advantage of their political followers. But once in power, they didn't necessarily have an idea of what to do, because they'd spent, all their years criticizing the political elite, and suddenly, the political elite was abandoning them for the most part, although there were some who wanted to be the so-called adults in the room to try to influence a Trump or a Bolsonaro or a Boris Johnson. But when an emergency strikes, like COVID-19, it exposes their incompetence. I mean, it's not as if they weren't incompetent before, but it accelerates their incompetence. It really exposes their inability to govern in even the most basic ways. It also exposes, in the case of Trump, Bolsonaro, the underlying kind of ideology of what Steve Bannon called the deconstruction of the administrative state. In other words, not only did they not have a governance strategy, but they were interested in deconstructing governance, in especially deconstructing any kind of checks and balances or oversight to facilitate state capture, to facilitate the kind of capture of resources for the benefit of themselves and their political circle. So the deconstruction of the administrative state left them quite exposed when an emergency of this nature happens, because they're not interested in actually having an administrative response, having a competent administrative response to a crisis. Okay, so those are the incompetents. The competents, for the most part, have been in power for a while. They have, if they didn't when they first became leaders, they have since developed quite elaborate governance strategies. They still might be interested in state capture, but they have elaborated sufficient administrative competence to deal with an emergency of this nature. So Orban, for instance, or Netanyahu, but let's take Orban, for instance. Orban has been in power since 2010 in Hungary. He's a career politician, has always been a politician, very clear about how to use the state to his own advantage. And his response to COVID, while I disagree with much of it, if you look at the numbers, has been relatively successful. Nothing compared to, say, the out of control numbers we see in Brazil, in the United States, in Russia, in India. So there we have a clear distinction between the competent and the incompetent, but we have a couple of surprises. In other words, people who are career politicians who show administrative competence, who've clearly failed in the COVID-19 era, far-right politicians. And the two I would point to above all in terms of these surprises would be Narendra Modi in India and Vladimir Putin in Russia. And the question is, well, why is this a surprise? I mean, it's no surprise that Trump or Bolsonaro completely failed to address COVID-19. And to a certain extent, it's no surprise that, say, Shinzo Abe in Japan and Viktor Orban in Hungary were successful in their competent approaches. But why weren't Modi and Putin successful? And I mean, you could point to the fact that they are heads of enormous countries, and it's simply impossible to kind of lock down a competent response to COVID-19 within those countries, but I don't find that particularly compelling. I think what the real explanation here is the nature of the healthcare systems in both countries. In Russia, the healthcare system has deteriorated from the Soviet era. Russia today spends about 3.5% of its GDP on health compared to about 6.5% of the OECD average. So it has a lot of beds, it has a lot of doctors, but it doesn't necessarily have a strong enough healthcare system. It's not sufficiently well funded, well resourced to deal with a crisis of this nature. And I think that is one major explanation for the growing numbers of COVID cases in Russia. India, I would argue for the same reason. Again, a relatively underfunded public healthcare system, with the exception, with a couple of exceptions. In Kerala, the province, we saw at least initially a very competent response, even as the problem was escalating in India more generally. The Kerala province was doing quite well. That has changed in the last few weeks, and that's largely attributed to the return of foreign workers from other countries to Kerala. But still, because of its competent leadership and because of its healthcare system, it's likely that it will continue to do better than India as a whole. Okay, so competent versus incompetent. In terms of whether it's a competent or an incompetent far-right leader, they all tried essentially to take some advantage of COVID-19 for power grabs. In other words, to say, look, I'm the only one who can really solve this problem, something that Trump has said all the time, and I'm going to need more power, basically, in order to handle this. You saw that, for instance, with Viktor Orban in Hungary. He passes what's called an enabling act. And with the enabling act, basically, it had no sunset clause. It could go on forever. And it gave Orban, unlimited power to throw people in jail if he felt it necessary, to suppress civil society and media, to expand his own executive power. And the interesting thing here is that Orban didn't have to do this. I mean, his party, Fidesz, has a supermajority in parliament. It can pass whatever it wants. So there actually was no specific policy reason for him to push for this power grab. It was a political reason. So I distinguish here between policy and political. In other words, he wanted it to be seen that he himself, Viktor Orban, personally was on top of the situation. Not his party, not parliament, but he personally. And in order to do that, he had to have this enabling act. Trump, as well, we've seen more recently, has attempted to expand his powers during the COVID-19 era. He, especially in response to Black Lives Matter demonstrations. And the most recent kind of power grab, if you will, was his use of federal agencies and the paramilitaries associated with federal agencies. The military had already said no, they weren't going to be used to suppress the demonstrations. So he went to Homeland Security, Marshal Service, and so on, which he has kind of pioneered in Portland, and he plans to spread to other cities. The other, another kind of power grab we saw was Vladimir Putin. Pushes for constitutional amendments, over 200 of them, all in one yes or no vote, up or down, which he pushes through. Does any number of interesting techniques to ensure a sufficient turnout for the referendum and to ensure a positive vote, which we don't have to go into. But again, here the interesting thing is that the Russian parliament had already passed all of these amendments. So for Putin, again, it wasn't really a policy issue. It was, like with Orban, a political issue. He wanted to demonstrate that his own personal power was strengthened at this time. And as, of course, as most of you know, the Constitution enables, the new Constitution, enables Putin to run for 2 more terms. So he'll rule until 2036 or so. So a very, very deliberate power grab that, again, Putin, I think, was able to use COVID-19 and the kind of general chaos in the country and the opposition being unable to kind of come out in force and demonstrations to push this through. You also saw power grabs in terms of how the far-right leaders have gone after journalists, have gone after the media. We saw that in the Philippines, Duterte going after Maria Ressa, Rappler, and other attempts to kind of go after what remains of an opposition to Duterte in the Philippines, and the deconstruction of oversight mechanisms more generally. And you saw Trump do this during the COVID era by firing inspectors general, basically eliminating any kind of oversight mechanisms for the bailout to ensure that the bailout would be fair instead of simply going to Trump's friends, for instance. You saw as well efforts by leaders to go after political opposition more specifically. You've seen this in Turkey, for instance, with Erdogan. Erdogan has attempted to continue to suppress what had previously been maybe the most promising political opposition, the pro-Kurdish People's Democratic Party. And there were about 51 mayors or so that were elected, mostly in the Kurdish areas, predominantly Kurdish areas. And Erdogan just kind of stepped in and declared direct rule, removing those mayors and installing his own lackeys, essentially. You've seen it with Putin again, removing Sergei Furgal, arresting him. He's a governor of Khabarovsk in the Russian Far East on what everyone has argued are trumped up charges of a murder case from 15 years ago. But Furgal was the leader of political opposition, and Putin decided this was an excellent opportunity to basically just arrest him and bring him to Moscow. And as I said, with Trump, you see the use of a power grab, not only to kind of figure out, and I think Trump is doing this to figure out who's on his side in terms of military forces in this country. He wants to see who is loyal to him. And if there's a contested election in November, he wants to know who he can count on. He's already determined that the military is not necessarily on his side, but he's using this current crisis to figure out if he can in fact count on Homeland Security, the Marshal Service, ICE, and so forth. But he's also deliberately targeting democratic held areas of the country, cities for the most part. And not just Portland, but of course he's targeting others as well. We've seen potential territorial grabs, not just power grabs. Obviously the most Obvious one is Netanyahu and Israel using the COVID crisis and the political crisis more generally in Israel to seize control of upwards of 30% of, to essentially annex 30% of occupied territory in the West Bank. That's on hold at the moment, but it's unquestionably something he wants to do and intends to do as long as he has the United States in his corner. And so I expect that to continue until the elections. But also Xi Jinping, instituting national security law in Hong Kong and using this current crisis and the world's distraction to consolidate control over Hong Kong, which of course is part of China. It was handed over, but had a kind of autonomous status. Okay, so that's the various tactics and techniques of the far right in power, using the COVID crisis to expand, consolidate power, suppress opposition, go after civil society, etc. Let's look briefly at parties and movements, far right parties and movements which are not in power but aspire to be in power. And there we see a very different story because for the most part, there's been a rally around the flag tendency during the COVID era, people rallying around the existing government and hoping that the government will kind of efficiently and competently address this pandemic. Now, there are major exceptions. United States, Brazil, we've seen the current government lose, in both cases, a tremendous amount of support. You've seen decline of support for Abe in Japan, for instance. But for other countries, you've seen the existing governments, liberal, conservative, what have you, support and decline of support for far-right parties, which prior to the coronavirus were threatening to become not just leading opposition, but potential ruling parties in the future. The Alternative for Deutschland, the Alternative for Germany, in Germany, for instance. Third largest opposition movement, looked like it was just going to be nothing but rising popularity. But we've seen during the COVID era, its popularity drop significantly from 15% to 9%. And that is a significant drop. Even though it has attempted to sustain its popularity by participating in anti-lockdown protests. But basically the Merkel government in Germany, because it has largely flattened the curve, has the trust of the German population. Folks may not like Merkel for political reasons, but they find her more trustworthy than an unknown factor like the Alternative for Deutschland. You've seen something similar throughout Europe. I mean, you've seen a decline in support, or at least a failure to thrive, if you will, by Salvini in Italy, the National Rally, Marine Le Pen's outfit in France, didn't do very well in the last local elections. Vox is flatlined in Spain. And, again, it's not just because the elite, political elite, the ruling parties have done more or less a good job in Europe in particular, or Australia, New Zealand, or Northeast Asia. It's not just because of that, but also because one of the major issues of the far right is, of course, immigration. But the immigration issue has largely been taken off the agenda because borders have been closed. So the far right no longer has that kind of issue that it can mobilize around. And the fact that they can't meet in person for rallies as they did prior to the COVID era, prior to lockdown, means that the far right has even more put its efforts into digital organizing. And so you've seen the rise of conspiracy theories that are promulgated online and that are then pushed into the mainstream by some far-right parties like the National Rally. And these conspiracy theories are, I'd rather not go into them in detail to give them even speaking about them gives them some unfortunate degree of legitimacy. But they're entirely illegitimate. But conspiracy theories about globalists like Microsoft, George Soros being behind COVID-19, Jews being behind COVID-19, Chinese being behind COVID-19, Muslims being behind COVID-19. And in the United States, even the most outrageous or outlandish of the theories, of course, the QAnon theory, that members of Hollywood, the political elite, are all part of a global sex trafficking scheme that Donald Trump almost by himself is trying to defeat. So this QAnon, which ordinarily would just lurk on the very fringes of political debate, has been embraced by a number of Republican candidates for Congress, including a couple who have a very good chance of winning. And so that's a pretty scary prospect. Okay, so that's the kind of far-right parties and movements. We've talked about far-right and power. And now briefly, the accelerationists, the extreme right. This is an entirely different category of folks. These are folks who don't care about organizing parties or trying to gain power in democratic fashion. They are fundamentally anti-democratic. They're interested only in bringing down the system and accelerating the collapse. And so however they do that, I mean, prior to the outbreak of COVID-19, it was largely, their idea was that they would instigate race riots, and race riots would kind of pit different sides of the United States against each other, and they would bring down the system, the liberal system, this way. And the accelerationists have seized on COVID-19 as this tremendous opportunity to sow discord, to increase the chaos factor, to, again, pit maskers versus anti-maskers. There's a wonderful opportunity. It's such a wonderful opportunity that they were even showing up at Black Lives Matter rallies, because they saw those as, again, another opportunity to accelerate the prospects of a race riot here in the United States. You've heard, I'm sure, of the various subgroups of these, the Boogaloo Boys, the 3%ers. I can go into some of those details if you like. But, they've also, these kind of these accelerationists have been a prominent force behind reopen rallies, and then, of course, now reopen schools. So they have positioned themselves as, it seems on the surface of it, a kind of a pro-stability, I mean, could reopen the economy. You don't, if you're interested in collapse, you wouldn't support reopening the economy necessarily, or reopening the schools. But I think in their minds, this is a tremendous opportunity to go against the liberal establishment, and ultimately to pull the liberal establishment down through a variety of means when the economy is reopened or the schools are reopened. Okay, then there are more narrowly focused kind of white nationalist movements, which I can talk about, the Atom-Waffen division or the base. And what's interesting here about these groups is that even though they are what the Europeans would call sovereignist movements, we would call nationalist movements, they are very internationalist in their perspective. In other words, they want to organize across borders. Now, in this case, they want to organize white people, white nationalists across borders, and they think that they can kind of build an extremist international in this fashion. All kind of coordinating in their countries, but according to some of the same messages. And one of the scary things I talk about in the report is the nature of the Great Replacement theory as a way to kind of bring together the far right and the extreme right. The Great Replacement theory, of course, is that people out there, immigrants, Muslims, Latinos, are all interested in replacing the majority population. Latinos in the United States, Muslims in Europe, Chinese in New Zealand. So the Great Replacement is a theory that the extreme right had used for quite a while, but it then leaked into the mainstream and has served as a kind of a common platform for both the far right and the extreme right, and even mainstream conservatives, because mainstream conservatives won't necessarily talk about it in race terms. They'll talk about it in civilization terms. And so you have a kind of meeting ground of mainstream conservatives, far right contesting for power, and the extreme right interested in bringing down the system around this great replacement narrative, a great replacement narrative that ultimately is unfortunately strengthened by the anti-immigrant sentiments brought up under COVID. So this is why I say a new right has emerged that kind of merges these, the far right, the extreme right, and even elements of mainstream conservatism in some countries. Okay, so finally, let me turn to the conclusion here. And before I do, let me just say, you know, Tad, you said that it's disorienting to hear that communist Xi Jinping is associated with the far right. And I wouldn't call him, you know, obviously far right in the sense of white nationalism or even in terms of the deconstruction of the administrative state, as Steve Bannon has recommended. He is an authoritarian, however, with very conservative nationalist values. And the values that he expressed towards minorities in his country are analogous to what the far right expresses towards minorities in their country. In other words, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, for instance, or the Tibetans, are seen as a security threat. And the nationalism of China is not the nationalism that we would associated with, say, Deng Xiaoping or even Mao, but a very narrow, much more ethnically based nationalism, combined with your kind of all China nationalism, but embedded there as well a kind of Han Chinese nationalism. So that's why I've put Xi Jinping in with the far right, in the sense that there's overlap on the authoritarian question. And yes, Nikhil, I would totally agree that Modi was totally incompetent before COVID-19, and this leads me, in fact, to the conclusion, which is COVID-19 is in many ways an X-ray of the problems in the society. It exposes what has been hidden, sometimes not very well hidden, and it accelerates trends that had previously been there. So if there had been a trend toward economic injustice, it accentuates that economic injustice. If there was racial injustice, it accentuates that racial injustice. So it is an X-ray of those social problems. So the question I think that a lot of people have is, which way are we going to go after COVID-19? Are we going to see a kind of a revival of some form of liberal democracy, a kind of a status quo ante, a Biden, for instance? Even if Biden has been pushed a little bit to the left, still kind of represents political status quo, liberal status quo in the United States. Are we going to see the right-wing authoritarians and the extremists take further advantage of this moment? Are we going to, I mean, obviously, Putin is potentially in power until 2036. Many of these rulers have been in power for a long time. Orban since 2010, Erdogan since the early 2000s. Abe since 2012. I mean, so long serving. And it's possible that we'll see, some of them just prove even stronger, which leads me to a kind of unsettling conclusion, which is it's tempting to argue that coronavirus unleashes a kind of political Darwinism in which the coronavirus itself is a kind of mutation, and political responses to this mutation are various, but some political leaders will clearly fail because they're incompetent, and they will be voted out of office or escorted out of office, or will have to resort to some clearly extra democratic maneuver to stay in office. But their failure will have been made clear by the elections. You might see even some opposition movements like the Alternative for Deutschland fail as well, because it was unable to take advantage of this moment. It couldn't articulate an effective policy. But you will also see, as I said, some political actors who have taken advantage of this moment excel and strengthen their position. The question I think a lot of people have as well is, well, that's the situation right now, but the economic consequences have not been driven home completely yet. I mean, the number of countries have engaged in rather large stimulus packages that are delaying the pain. It's still a lot of pain, don't get me wrong, huge levels of unemployment, but unemployment benefits, and then obviously delays on evictions here in the United States, the government stepping in Europe and basically paying people's salaries. So some of that pain is being postponed. And what will happen when it's no longer being postponed, when unemployment really hits, when eviction really hits? And that leads me to the question of the third possibility. I mentioned that we would see either the return of the liberal status quo, or we would see the strengthening of the far right. Of course, there is a possibility that the left will emerge stronger as a result of this crisis. The popular mobilization, which we are seeing regardless of restrictions on gathering and assembly, the popular mobilization will effectively produce a left alternative that is critical of globalization, critical of the political elites, but doesn't have any of the racism or misogyny of the far right, offer people a credible alternative at a time of economic collapse. And so that's my hope, and coming out of that, seeing as well a rebuilding of internationalism. We've seen liberal internationalism and its discrediting during the globalization era. We're seeing now the assertion of a right-wing internationalism, kind of an axis of authoritarian leaders, as well as networking at the digital level among far-right actors. And now I think it's time for the left again to revive an internationalism that had been so prominent in the late 1990s, but which has gone into kind of hibernation. That ultimately is what I'd like to see take place. So that's my presentation. And I'm going to turn to people's questions now. It's easier for me to look at the Q&A function rather than the chat, but I'll try to capture both. So Gary had a question about the World Congress of Families, and I didn't talk so much about the far right organizing at the civil society level. I mean, we think of civil society, often as being kind of progressive, but civil society includes everybody. Any organization, the National Rifle Association, evangelical church organizations, and the World Congress of Families is one of those. It pushes an evangelical message, but it's not so much interested in proselytizing, at least not proselytizing in a religious sense. It's interested in proselytizing in a cultural sense. And so the World Congress of Families has pushed, for instance, for marriage between a man and a woman as being the only acceptable form of marriage. So very much opposed to LGBTQ agenda. And it has been successful. It has been successful in Russia. I mentioned the constitutional amendments, and one of the 200 is to establish marriage as being only between a man and a woman. Viktor Orban in Hungary accomplished the same thing. They're pushing it in Poland. They're pushing it in the global South. And so the World Congress of Families has been rather successful in this. There's another tier of civil society, right-wing civil society, that works specifically on immigration questions and really pushes for tighter borders around the world. In all of these cases, they rely on a lot of right-wing lawyers who are basically litigating these questions in courts around the world. And so these organizations provide money and support for these lawyers. And Gary, you asked about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which is right. Trump canceled as one of his first acts as president, and again, very much as part of his anti-globalization message, which had a great deal of appeal to folks who had been left behind by globalization. I should say that, in writing about these issues, I often refer to A and B. In Poland, for instance, people who benefited from the economic changes after 1989, they were Poland A. The people who didn't benefit were Poland B. And the Poland A basically ruled Poland from, into the 2000s, from 1990 until the 2000s, mid-2000s. But then Poland B started to take over, and most recently Poland B has consolidated its power. There were presidential elections in Poland recently, and Poland B just squeaked by and re-electing Duda. But there's also Europe A and B, America A and B, and I would say basically, planet A and B. And planet B has not, benefited from globalization. And that's the kind of larger group of people that the far right is appealing to, and which Trump has appealed to here in the United States. The left here and liberals, I don't think have quite figured out a consensus position on free trade issues. I mean, we've talked about free trade, including environmental and labor agreements, kind of improving free trade agreements, and stripping out those things which we really don't like investor state protection clauses. In other words, protecting the corporations from being kind of deregulated out of power in the global south. So there are ways of definitely improving trade agreements, but I don't think we've really come out with a strong consensus position that can have widespread appeal and kind of take away the support of that the far right has garnered. And then Catherine, best way to get involved to deal with a potential Trump power grab in November. So do I think Trump will institute martial law? That's a very good question. I mean, there's a lot of speculation that Trump is laying the groundwork now for a kind of seizure of power. I think that if the military had allowed him to enact the insurrection law and basically send the military out into the streets to suppress Black Lives Matters protests, that would have been a very, very clear sign that Trump could count on the military in a martial law situation. But the fact that they didn't, and that there's significant opposition to Trump throughout the military, and obviously from retired military as well, I think puts that off the table. Now, yeah, you could declare martial law and rely on the paramilitary forces, as he has in Portland and presumably in Chicago, but the military, the U.S. military is obviously a much larger institution, and it's unclear also whether the police would, or which side the police would fall in this question. So a more likely scenario from my point of view is that Trump will simply call into question the elections and kind of try to extend that uncertainty as long as possible while the Republican Party tries to figure out some way of either gaming the results of the Electoral College, reopening the election in some form. What can we do about this? Well, I think there's going to be both a political and a legal struggle come November. I think there's going to be a need for as many people as possible to participate as poll watchers. In other words, to ensure the transparency of this election and as much as possible steal away that argument from Trump that the elections are illegitimate. And so I think that is, obviously we're a nonpartisan organization at IPS. I can only give you my own personal opinion about, working as hard as possible to remove Trump from office. But That's my personal opinion, but generally working as much as possible to ensure safe and secure elections, to make sure people can vote, people are voting. And that seems to me the most important thing to talk about. Peter has talked about an alliance between the left and the neocon right on issues of trade and foreign policy. And I think there is some, I would say there's some parallelism. I'm not sure I would say there's really an alliance, although let's say the Quincy Institute here in Washington, DC, funded by George Soros and one of the Koch brothers. I mean, that obviously is an alliance, but I mean, if you look at the stuff they write, for the most part, it's not neocon. I mean, it doesn't really reflect Koch thinking on foreign policy issues. It does reflect a kind of parallel desire to see a shrinking of US military footprint overseas, reduction of military bases, shrinking of the military budget. Now, the reason it's parallel is because, of course, the left wants to reduce the military budget and put that money into social needs. The libertarian / neoconservatives want to reduce, well, let's say the libertarians in this sense, not the neocons. Libertarians want to reduce the military budget and not put that money anywhere because they're interested in reducing the government completely. So there's parallelism, not necessarily an alliance. And the same, I think, holds true on trade issues. But again, you know, what the right wants in terms of trade is conflicted. I mean, because there's the anti-globalist right, and then there's the kind of pro-free trade right. And so even within the right wing, there's considerable tension. And on the left, again, you know, there's some disagreement about how best strategically to address the problems with free trade as it exists. What makes the paramilitary so obedient to POTUS? And that's a really interesting question. You know, you would think it would be the opposite in some sense, because in the military you have the deference, the chain of command, and obviously you follow what the commander-in-chief has said. But Trump has so little legitimacy as a commander-in-chief. I mean, obviously didn't serve in the military, he has said scandalous things about the military. He has opposed many of the Pentagon's pet projects, which I happen to oppose too, but that's beside the point. In any case, he doesn't command the respect of the military, and no matter who he installs as the head of the Pentagon, that lack of legitimacy still holds true. So I think that the military is listening to the head of the Pentagon rather than to Trump. When it comes to the paramilitaries, you know, Trump has been unfortunately effective in appointing kind of people, his lackeys, if you will, in these agencies, and getting these agencies to purge the disloyal, and he's put a lot of money into ICE, border protection, homeland security. So, you know, there's an economic interest and an ideological interest that I think doesn't exist so much with the military, because these agencies are really the executors of Trump's policies on the ground in the United States on immigration policies. Back to, okay. Other questions? Yeah, so, and Tad basically asked the same question about Trump leaving office or not leaving office, and what does Joe Biden have in mind? You know, the problem here, of course, is that generally speaking, the Democrats play by the rules. Now, those rules can be corrupt, you know, when it comes to, let's say, the military-industrial complex, or, you know, funding elections. I may disagree with those particular rules, but Democrats generally play by those rules. Republicans don't play by any rules whatsoever, and Trump, on top of that, is even more of a scofflaw. I mean, he is I think, congenitally incapable of following rules. He sees a rule, he wants to break it. So we have an asymmetry here going into the November election. The Republicans will do whatever it takes, and Trump will do whatever it takes, break whatever rules, whatever laws, whatever articles of the Constitution to win the election. Democrats, well, they're still thinking, well, how do we, ensure a fair and transparent election? How do we make sure the laws are being followed? My response to that question betrayed a similar mindset on my part. We have, people at the polls, making sure it's a fair election. There have been some Democrats who have resorted to dirty tricks, interesting dirty tricks, but for the most part, I think the Democrats are expecting that the lawyers will win the election ultimately if Trump refuses to vacate office, and they will litigate him out, or with the military on its side, escort him out. Other questions you might have, please just, we have a little bit more time, or not. I mean, we could also shut it down early. I'm hungry, I could use lunch. But I'm happy to address any other questions you might have. Why don't protesters in the United States demand the resignation of Trump? That's how revolutions succeed in other countries. What makes the US different in this respect? That's a good question. And, especially with demonstrators in Mali, bringing down or hoping to bring down the leader there. We've seen that was very successful throughout the Arab Spring, those demands for resignation. Or in South Korea, where protesters were successful in pushing the impeachment, basically, of their previous leader. Why don't we do that here in the United States? I'm not exactly sure. I mean, certainly if you go to demonstrations here in the United States, you'll hear people calling for resignation. But my guess is that it's a fear that, well, Mike Pence would not be any better, and in fact could be, it's hard to say worse, but Pence is a more moderating influence within the Republican Party. In other words, he can bring together different wings of the party in a way that Trump can't. He is an operator in Congress in a way that Trump isn't. In other words, whereas I identify Trump as an incompetent versus competent right-wing leaders, Pence could, tip the balance and make the United States into a competently led far-right authoritarian government, unfortunately. That might play one role. Of course, we also saw that impeachment failed, and it failed not because of anything, some brilliant strategies or retorts on the part of Trump. It failed simply through power politics by the Republican Party. So I think people realize that resignation of Donald Trump is not a resignation of the Republican Party, that in order to change politics in this country, the Republican Party has to be removed. And now we can all call for the resignation of Republican Party leaders we don't like, but we have an election coming up in November, so I think people are seeing that as the most effective way of removing them. Jerome asked, will evictions here lead to riots for food and housing? That's a good question. We might see an explosion of discontent. It really depends on, I think, the second wave of coronavirus. It depends on the second tranche of bailout funds. It depends on how cities respond. Some cities have more or less competent leadership and are able, even in constrained circumstances, to find ways of helping people during difficult times. So I think it will depend on a number of factors, and it will be different from city to city and state to state. What other, Sean, Sebastian, what do you think about white supremacist disinformation campaigns mobilizing police and armed vigilantes? Bus full of Antifa. How do you see this disinformation architecture being used to tamper with the election? Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's basically a bottom-up and a top-down strategy here. The top-down from Trump is to associate Democrats. I mean, it was very interesting in one of his recent statements. He said they're led by Democrats, they're led by radical Democrats, they're led by socialists, they're led by communists. So, it's this kind of transitive property linking Democrats with communists and with Antifa. So from the top down, Trump is doing his best to kind of delegitimate the Democratic Party and associating it with extreme elements. And from the bottom up, you have, as you put it, a disinformation campaign by white supremacists, kind of painting the predominantly peaceful demonstrations as the work of extremist elements. And so you have a kind of scissors technique, bottom up and top down, with the Democrats and the peaceful protesters in the middle. And that's kind of the electoral strategy, to squeeze the two together and delegitimate them. And I think it'll be extraordinarily important for for there to be what used to be called the popular front, for there to be as big a tent as possible in the opposition to Trump and white supremacy in this country. And after the elections, we can assert our different positions again. But between now and November, there has to be a united front. So this kind of scissors attempt, you widen the tent as big as possible to make this scissors effort ineffectual. Should we depend on Democrats and lawyers to assure an open, fair election if the Congress and Senate cannot represent and professionally do their job to represent and do the thing? Yes, well, that is a tough question. I mean, I don't believe that lawyers themselves are going to be able to ensure that, we have a fair election. I mean, this is a question of power. As I said before, we have Democrats who play by the rules, more or less, and Republicans who don't play by the rules. In order to kind of level the playing field, I mean, either you have Democrats stop playing by the rules, which I don't think is going to happen, or you have a powerful counterforce. You have enough people coming together and appearing in the streets, demonstrating people power in a variety of different forms that basically empower the congressional representatives that we agree with, lawyers that we agree with, to do their jobs. They can only do their jobs if they have enough people behind them supporting them. So I think that's the way you kind of get around that. Tom asks about, or points out, distinction between anti-globalists and the pro-free trade right, and the impact of the climate crisis. And I think I would agree that that this is, the climate crisis is an opportunity for this kind of big tent moment, and really a tent that includes a lot of folks that previously had not even considered themselves political. They might not care about policies. In other words, in the same way that the far right used the cultural issue of immigration and racism to really motivate people to come into their side, people who didn't care about politics or economics. I think climate change can serve that function for progressives. In other words, people who don't necessarily care about economics, politics necessarily, but they are worried about the fate of the planet. They're worried that the planet might burn up. And so I think they can be brought into a large tent and to really have that attached to a political program. And that political program, of course, would be a Green New Deal here in the United States, a global Green New Deal internationally. In other words, something that was political and economic, but the motivation of folks to get on board or to enter this big tent would not necessarily be economic or political to begin with. And the far right, and Tom and I have talked about this, the far right basically has no answer to climate change. It either denies it, as so many of the far right have denied the existence or the lethality of COVID, or they have the worst kind of Band-Aid approaches, or even worse, they simply believe they can build bigger walls and keep people out. And that ultimately is a response to climate change. I mean, the waters rise, desperate people are trying to get away from islands and coastal areas, and you build walls to prevent them from coming into your country. And that's the far right's response. So, so I think that is a really good political opportunity. Jerome, you asked about how much the vote can be suppressed. And, you know, we already see the vote suppression taking place, the efforts in Florida to remove, and folks in Florida voted to allow formerly incarcerated to vote. And that is something the Republicans are pushing back against, making it as difficult as possible for folks to vote if they had been in prison by effectively imposing a poll tax, making them pay, for things that are outstanding debts. This should have nothing to do with whether they can vote or not vote. So there's that. There's closing of voting sites. There's purging of voting rolls. There is calling into question mail-in ballots. In other words, the Republican Party is doing whatever it can to suppress the election results right now, and to set the stage. And Trump is very clear about this. I mean, one of his perhaps unguarded moments, although with Trump every moment is an unguarded moment, he said that if everyone was allowed to vote, Republicans would never win again. I mean, the Republican Party knows that it's a minority party. And it's been a minority party for a while, and it knows that it will only become even more of a minority party in the future. The only way it can survive as a political party is to suppress the vote. And so once the vote is not suppressed, the Republican Party, as it is now constituted, will disappear as a political party. It will go the way of the Whigs, the Federalists. It will be a non-party. That is a specific case here in the United States. Unfortunately, and I want to emphasize this, the far right, unfortunately, it is politically popular when it's in power in other countries. I mean, the poll ratings for Putin in Russia, they dipped a little bit, but they're back up around nearly 70%. The polls support for Duterte are quite high, although a friend of mine in the Philippines tells me the polls can't be trusted. That might be true, because of course, in a country where 27,000 people have been killed by the government or by the police in extrajudicial killings, people are reticent to tell anybody what they really think in terms of their opinions about Duterte. But the far right in Poland and Hungary, quite popular. So, I don't want to assume that, the far right around the world is kind of heading into the dustbin of history simply because it either mismanaged COVID-19 or has no answer to climate change, or for whatever vulnerabilities it has, politically speaking. But I do think that here in the United States, the Republican Party has clearly, it has read the political winds and decided to go headfirst against these headwinds. And that is a recipe eventually, if not, I expect in this election, but certainly in the future, a recipe for disaster. We have 15 more minutes, and see any other questions. We have one from Husam. Can citizens and civil society call upon international election monitors for the election? Yes, in fact, I believe there was just recently I think it was the 2018 elections, we had foreign monitors for the first time. I'd have to check on that, but if memory serves, that's the case. So I think we have a precedent, and we should fully use that precedent, because I think this is the first time in history that we are going into an election with the result already up in the air. I mean, 2016, there were concerns, but no one, or I should say few people, expected that Trump would win. I didn't think Trump would win. And few people expected that Russian interference or voter suppression, or whatever you want to ascribe Trump's victory to, was going to play a major role. Going into this election, it's quite a different matter, because Trump has already said he may not honor the election. The Republican Party is not playing by the rules. So yes, this is the first time. So I think this is definitely a time to bring in international monitors. And you know, the problem, of course, is that international monitors are globalists. They are representatives of global civil society, and therefore, in the minds of Trump opponents, they are, by definition, anti-Trump. And you know, so that is I anticipate that will be an argument that the Trump forces will use if they lose, and international monitors certify that it was a sufficiently fair election. But you know, it's hard to know. I think I have answered all of your questions and your comments, but I'm happy to wait a minute or two to see if you have any other questions. Brendan, as a centrist, I feel I'm equally disenfranchised. Colorado allows independents to vote. You see the possibility of expanding to more states. Yes, actually. I mean, I think there is, as I said before, there is a lot of disenchantment with mainstream parties. And that's not just in the United States, it's throughout the world. And I think there has to be some effective electoral changes to reflect that disenchantment. Now, in most countries, you have the possibility of vibrant third, fourth, fifth, sixth parties to run and win representation. You also have, different voting mechanisms, not first past the post here in the United States, but you have different ways of identifying, whether you have party lists, proportional representation, weighted voting. I mean, so there are various ways, various electoral reforms, I think, that can allow a greater diversity of political expression. This country, we of course lag behind in so many respects, but I think the ability for independents to vote in different primaries is a very good a good step that should be adopted by other parties. By other states. And I think that the other thing, of course, is there has to be a reduction of the impact of money on politics. I mean, as long as there's going to be, this huge amount of money required to run for basically any office, any statewide office, forget about it for third parties for the most part. So some really aggressive campaign finance reform, I think, is also really necessary. Did I see the last one, Catherine? What other historical examples would you look to for this moment? What lessons can we learn how to prevent a fascist takeover? That is a good question. Again, I would say, to prevent a fascist takeover, you really need a popular front approach. When the popular front breaks down, as it did in Germany prior to the election of the Nazis, it paves the way for a divide and conquer approach by a strong, committed, disciplined party. And there's no question the Republican Party is committed and disciplined, however incompetent it might be at governing a country. It is very competent at running for elections, marshaling resources, dirty politicking, etc. So in order to deal with that, there has to, as I said, popular from big picture. We did see a good example of a country that successfully removed one of its kind of neo-fascist leaders was Slovakia. Slovakia separated from Czechoslovakia in 1993. The two countries separated, and Vladimir Mečiar became the head of the country of Slovakia. And he was just kind of a run-of-the-mill former communist nationalist. But he became, once he was the leader of a single country, far more anti-European Union, far more anti-Roma, far more exclusionist and dictatorial in his approach. And essentially what happened in Slovakia between 1993 and 2000 was the revival of civil society and then creation of a new civil society, mostly by young people. The older folks were like, gosh, I'm tired. I don't think I can do this again. Defeat yet another politically extreme faction. And I know why we failed in the past, and I just don't see any path forward. Young people, on the other hand, have the virtue of not having necessarily failed before, and therefore go in with a certain very necessary naivete about what is possible. And that naivete is energizing, and at a certain point, they discover they're not naive. In fact, you can change things if you work hard enough. And so I believe that it's really the younger generation that has the energy and the kind of group naivete, a very necessary naivete, or innocence, if you will, to prevent Trump from being reelected, which is essentially what happened in Slovakia in 2000. So that would be a good historical example. James discussed the role of the wealthy in enabling Trump and his Republican supporters. How can they be held accountable? Yeah, I mean, this is the paradox of Trump. Of course, when he was running in the primary, he basically said F you to wealthy donors. I'm not going to listen to you. I have my own source of funding. I'm a billionaire. I don't need your money. But of course, then he turned around and accepted lots of money. And basically it was Sheldon Adelson, the casino magnate, and his wife who bailed out Trump with enough money to keep the campaign going through that summer and into the fall. And then once he became president, of course, Trump did exactly what he said he wasn't going to do, which was he did exactly what his rich donors wanted him to do, which when it came to Sheldon Adelson was to put forward the most radically right-wing policy toward Israel that the United States had ever adopted. So how do we deal with these right-wing donors? Well, I mean, twofold. I mean, our own scissors approach, if you will. The first is, as I said, campaign finance reform. In other words, to remove their impact on politics. They can have as much money as they want, at least according to this narrow argument, but they can't use it to influence politics. The second is to reduce the amount of money they have. And there are plenty of plans, Elizabeth Warren on down, to enact wealth taxes that bring fairness and equity to our economic situation in this country. Reducing the amount of wealth they have reduces the amount of impact they have politically if we're not able to simultaneously remove the impact of money on politics. So that's the scissors approach I would recommend for this. 5 more minutes, and I think I've answered. Remind me if I haven't. It's hard to follow both the chat and the Q&A. But Matthew says we're too narcissistic to agree on any one demand, and I mean there is some truth to that. We are an individualistic country here, and it's very difficult for us to have the kind of social movements that we've seen in some other countries, where there's either party discipline when it comes to political parties, or a kind of solidarity that's necessary to have a unified agenda and advance that agenda, even when you might not agree with all of it. Here in the United States, it's like you see something you agree with 95%, and you see the 5% you disagree, and you're like, forget it. You know, I'm not going to subscribe to that platform because I disagree with that 5%. Other countries, you know, there's less of that kind of what the Poles would call liberum veto. In other words, vetoing something because of one disagreement with it. And so I do think that that is something we have to discover or rediscover here in the United States. In a time of declining union membership, in a time of declining party membership as well, and a time of bowling alone. It's been 25 years since we've had that argument about the decline of American participation in community and group activities. We have to really assert a new kind of solidarity that allows us to work together even when we disagree on some things. And those are the kinds of political or organizing skills that I'm hoping the next generation has that maybe my generation simply doesn't have. Maybe, Netvo, we can call it a day there. I really want to thank you for all of your excellent your questions and comments. It's been really a wonderful opportunity to talk to you, and I recommend that you go to the top of the chat to get a link to the IPS report, and I hope we'll be in conversation again.
Thank you, John. Everybody check out the remaining webinars we got. Let me see if I can, that we have. I'm gonna speak like my mother would prefer me to speak. So I'm gonna put this link here. We have a couple more we have one more that's part of this series and another one that's not part of the series, but it's also very informative and cutting edge. And so check out check out those on this link, and we'll see you next time. Make sure to share them. We very much appreciate people sharing them on social media. Yeah. All right, thank you, John. Thank you, everybody.